Join me in welcoming Professor Mehta to Harvard and to the South Asia Without Borders series. I think he probably needs no introduction to most of you in the room, but I think I'll take a few minutes to introduce him to you anyways. Professor Mehta did his BA at Swarthmore College and finished his Ph.D. at Princeton, and has taught at many universities throughout the country, including Princeton, Cornell, MIT, Chicago, Penn, and Amherst College. He's currently Distinguished Professor of Political Science at CUNY Graduate Center in New York. He's published 2 books and numerous articles. The 2 books, which many of you may know, the first is called The Anxiety of Freedom, Imagination, Individuality, and the Political Thought of John Locke, which is a fantastic book that I think everyone should absolutely read. The other is the more celebrated and equally excellent book called Liberalism and Empire, which was published by the University of Chicago in 2000. It was awarded the David Greenstone Prize for the best book in political theory by the American Political Science Association. And in 2003, Professor Mehta was a recipient of what's called the Carnegie Fellowship, and was designated as a Carnegie Scholar. Today, Uday's going to talk about his latest book project, which I don't know if it has the same title still, but the title is War, Peace, and Nonviolence. It's changed. The title has changed of the book. So maybe
the title is called A Different Vision, Gandhi's Critique of Political Rationality.
Oh, I like that. Today he's going to speak on work as part of that ongoing project. He's going to speak on Gandhi and political theory, and the title of his talk is Gandhi on Courage and Ethics and Society. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mehta back to Harvard.
Thank you very much, Parimal. Parimal just told me that he liked my first book on Locke, and I now know the the 4th person who read it, because other than family members, I don't think anybody else read it, so I'm grateful.
It'll now be flying off the shelves.
Right. This paper is an attempt to think about what it means to place courage and related notions, such as the willingness to die and self-sacrifice, at the center of one's conception of life and public action for both individuals and collectivities. The particular example of such an emphasis that I will explore is that of Gandhi. I want to start by considering an event from 1919. On the morning of February 24th, 1919, in a context vitiated by the recent introduction of the Rowlatt Bills, which proposed to all but explicitly suspend the individual rights of Indians along with their rights of association and assembly, Gandhi and others issued the Satyagraha Pledge, that is the call for civil disobedience. It was an act which Gandhi called, and I quote, the most momentous in the history of India, end of quote. The pledge stated, and again I quote, in the event of these bills becoming law and until they are withdrawn, we shall refuse civilly to obey the laws, and we further affirm that in this struggle we will faithfully follow truth and refrain from violence to life, person, and property, end of quote. In a telegram sent the same day to the Viceroy's private secretary, Gandhi again emphasized that the proposed national satyagraha was to be a civil form of action, which, as he said, and I quote, that it is much better that people say openly what they have in their hearts without fear of consequences and enforce the dictates of their own conscience, end of quote. What did Gandhi mean in this and in every other context where he issued the call for satyagraha or civil disobedience by insisting that such action be civil? Why did civility, on his understanding, turn on notions such as conscience, truth, suffering, the dictates of the heart, the ability to be steadfast, the practice of fasting, the injunction to refrain from designating an enemy, the courage of being prepared to stand alone, and of course abjuring from all forms of violence? Why did civility ultimately rest on the willingness to be prepared to sacrifice one's own life? In brief, what was the civil component of such action, which in its rigors was so starkly internal, relying as it did above all else on the internal resoluteness of the individual. And this despite a provocation which, like the Rollet bills, was unmistakably political and collectively intended and felt. The answers to these questions draw in their fold Gandhi's most radical reflections and interventions into Indian modernity, while also implicitly delineating that modernity from similar European and nationalist patterns. They also present a stark contrast to many prevailing ideas regarding the basis and form of political protest. Civility for Gandhi was unrelated to the matter of producing a society that attended to the problems of a civilizing process, either as a prelude to a commercial civilization or as the groundwork for democratic or other forms of politics. It was not tied to the demands of living with religious plurality or religious skepticism, the historical exigencies that had been central to the articulation of civility in the European context. Similarly, nor was civility offered as a redress to the various forms of hierarchy that marked Indian social relations. It was not in the main motivated by the experience or the threat of pervasive violence, exploitation, or oppression. And finally, whatever the connection civil action may have had to anti-imperial agitation and the articulation of a politically vibrant Indian public, for Gandhi that connection was almost entirely and merely circumstantial and not related to its deeper significance. Only to the extent that civility required explaining and giving reasons for one's behavior was it at all a social and political virtue. In this latter sense, it was linked to the idea of public reasoning. Instead, for Gandhi, civility was a mode of individual comportment which had the crucial feature of tying ethics to politics in a way that never allowed the latter to assume an independence of purpose and instrumentality. Civility referred to that kernel of what it meant to be human, that ember in the midst of social and political life that had the potential of constantly unsettling or inflaming those contexts with demands that invariably exceeded the contours of the social and the political by pointing to something beyond them. Because it referred to a metaphysical core of what it meant to be human, it could not be abstracted from the issue of death, self-sacrifice, and courage. Ultimately, for Gandhi, civility instantiated the ineradicable presence and challenge of the absolute in the midst of the everyday routines of life and struggle. This is what resists the incorporation of the Gandhian account of ethics, politics, and protest into the narratives that Marx, Weber, Lenin, and others gave of European modernity, with its ineluctable normalization and rationalization and its equally entrenched demands for justice, typically spurred by a well-organized collectivity. But let me first return to the events of the spring of 1919 and to the call for satyagraha following the introduction of the Rollet bills. As was his norm, Gandhi was meticulous in his preparation for any action, especially those which he publicly authorized. I want to summarize and paraphrase the instructions he gave to the volunteers who were gathering signatures for the potential satyagrahis. First, volunteers were to be mindful that a single genuine recruit who realized the responsibilities that came with signing the pledge was better than 100 signatories who did not understand the gravity of the matter. Second, volunteers were to elaborate the meaning and the significance of taking a vow, which the pledge amounted to. This required, and I quote, that volunteers must explain to the signatory the full significance of the word civilly. It involves something solemn. Like vows, civil action, Gandhi said, were, and I'm quoting again, taken only with respect to matters otherwise difficult to accomplish, when, after a series of efforts, we fail in doing certain things, by taking a vow, we do them. By taking a vow, we draw a cordon around ourselves, from which we may never be free. From which we may never be, and thus we avoid failure. Anything less than such an inflexible determination cannot be called a vow, end of quote. A vow was thus an exacting commitment about how to behave under conditions where the amplitude of choice itself was denied. But it was more than just a stipulation of a particular form of behavior. A vow was different from other intentions. It involved a self-consciousness about the conditions under which life itself was worth living, hence a self-consciousness about death and self-sacrifice. As part of this, volunteers were to explain to the intended signatories that in signing the pledge, they were committing themselves to, and now I quote again, bear every kind of suffering and sacrifice, and that they must be prepared to carry out the struggle single-handedly, even if left alone, end of quote. The third broad instruction was to the potential signatories. He or she was to be fully conscious that during the struggle, they were to be fearlessly committed to the truth and to ahimsa, that is, to nonviolence. Under no circumstances were they to misrepresent the truth, even if doing so would serve the national cause or undermine the imperial authorities. But above all, in acting civilly, the signatories were committing themselves to, and now I quote again, bear pain, endure suffering, and live with the consciousness that they were committing themselves to be prepared to die for their convictions, end of quote. In a manner that further delineated and raised the boundaries around the individual, that is the cordon around the self, Gandhi on April 12th issued additional instructions. There were to be no processions, no organized demonstrations, no hartals or work stoppages. All police orders were to be obeyed, no stone throwing, no obstruction of traffic, no pressure was to be exercised on anyone, including crucially on those who did not sign the pledge. There was to be no resistance offered while being imprisoned, and no support shown for those who were imprisoned. If satyagraha and the forms of behavior that it mandated were political acts, they had to articulate themselves without resort to the idea of an enemy or a comrade, or the power in numbers, or the expression of a collective will, or the ability by violence or other powerful means to undermine the will of the imperial authorities, or the coordinated nature of protest. Gandhi eschewed all these familiar modalities of political action and protest. What he advocated had no resonance with either the vanguardism of the well-organized Leninist cadre or with the legal and representational challenges that liberal moderates had proposed, which after all also turned on the logic of numbers. Indeed, even though satyagraha was projected as a national response to the bills, it was clear from all the conditions and constraints that Gandhi placed on its public form and the demands of the demanding personal conditions that it had to be that had to be met, that it was hardly designed to give a fillip to mass action. There was something audacious. Some, of course, called it naive. Others thought of it as a subtle form of complicity with the imperial authorities, in Gandhi's firm conviction that the bills would be withdrawn by the utter lack of a calculus that distinguished friend and enemy, and supporter and opponents. From Gandhi's perspective, it made no difference that the love was extended to an opponent or a friend, or that the suffering occurred on account of the government or others who were also critical of it, but who were at least nominally one's own supporters, or that the truth was completely divorced from circumstantial and tactical considerations. Gandhi denies all these familiar categories and the logic that typically accompanied them, and through which they are understood, and through which we understand the rationale of political protest. Moreover, Gandhi denies the familiar understanding of political change and causality. If we take him at his word, he did actually believe that the purity of the penance and sacrifice offered by a handful of people could and would result in the revoking of bills that had the full statutory and material support of the mightiest political power on earth. It recalls his comments in Hind Swaraj, where he asserted that Swaraj itself did not require a mass movement, but could be had, as he said, in an instant by the genuine fortitude of a few people. One can view such comments as empirical predictions, in which case their warrant seems implausible, and Gandhi's rhetoric overextended and unduly optimistic. But such a perspective misses the point. These claims are more interesting in suggesting how, on Gandhi's reckoning, the logic of political transformation was itself susceptible to civil and ethical practices which were pegged to self-suffering and indifferent to familiar political and social categories, and which therefore defied the very terms in which politics understood itself. One stark implication of abjuring from familiar political categories, such as friend and enemy, or in the context of the time, British and Indians, was that Gandhi did not hesitate from reversing the vector of civil action so that its object suddenly became the satyagrahis themselves, rather than the British and the Rollitt bills. In April, when there was a protest, when there was the prospect of his imminent arrest, mayhem and other forms of violence broke out in the city of Ahmedabad. Buildings were burnt, telegraph wires cut, trains stopped, shops plundered, and some people killed. Gandhi was horrified and ashamed. As he said, quote, "A rapier run through my body could hardly have pained me more," end of quote. He insisted that full amends be made by the so-called satyagrahis for this behavior. Property losses were to be fully compensated, public buildings rebuilt at no cost to the government. Financial collections were to be taken for those who had lost family members. But most strikingly, Gandhi informed the people of Ahmedabad, quote, "The occasion has arrived when I should offer satyagraha against ourselves for the violence that has occurred," end of quote. He followed this by writing to the private secretary of the Viceroy, informing him that in the most contrite terms, quote, "My satyagraha, therefore, will at the present moment be directed against my own countrymen." This took the form of a fast. What did it mean to offer satyagraha against oneself or one's own people? It could not conceptually be squared with the idea of acting against an enemy or acting for a cause. Nor could it be made sense of in terms of achieving any external goal. Indeed, one of Gandhi's most emphatic riposts to those who had violated the terms of the pledge was that in doing so they had converted a civil act into a political act and thus undermined the ground of the former. The acts of violence and mayhem had inevitably raised questions of public order, criminal culpability, legal responsibility, grounds of compensation, etc. To these, there was only a political and administrative answer. Instead, as Gandhi made clear, the sole purpose of acting in a civil way was to deepen one's relationship to oneself and hence the country's relationship to itself. This was a way of drawing a cordon around the self in the midst of a politically febrile context. In responding as he did to the violence in Ahmedabad and refusing to cede to a conception of political transformation in which such change could only occur through a commensurate type of political and collective behavior, such a conception made change dependent on opposition, protest, or a social movement with the appropriate level of support. And hence, ultimately, it was dependent on the logic of numbers. Instead, Gandhi claimed that the political domain was not itself fully self-subsistent, because it could not inoculate itself against the pressures of the essentially human or the purely ethical. His point was not to offer a political response to a political predicament, but rather a civil and ethical retort to the entire predicament of politics. The core of Gandhi's notion of civil action and protest was the idea of self-sacrifice and the willingness to die. Coupled with these were the cognate ideas of fearlessness and courage. These were all individual qualities that could not readily qualify the behavior of groups or classes as such. Gandhi's most searching reflections into fear, courage, sacrifice, death, and civility belong to the context of the First World War. In the summer of 1918, Gandhi came to the firm conviction that it was essential for India to contribute men who would be prepared to fight alongside the British and others in the war effort in Europe. This offer was to be unconditional and not pegged to the British introducing or promising to introduce any political reforms in India. As he said in a letter to the Viceroy, quote, "I recognize that in this hour of danger, we must give, as we have decided to give, ungrudgingly and unequivocally support to the empire." End of quote. He went on to say that if I could make my countrymen retrace their steps, I would make them withdraw all the Congress Party's resolutions and not whisper a word about home rule or responsible government during the dependency of the war. I would make India offer all her able-bodied sons as a sacrifice to the empire at this critical moment. It will be national suicide not to recognize this elementary truth. We must perceive that if we serve to save the empire, we have in that very act secured home rule. End of quote. It is worth noting, Gandhi was that for Gandhi it was the very act of serving in the war, that is, of fighting and being prepared to die for the empire, that would secure home rule. Such an act was not a precondition for home rule. Rather, it was home rule itself. Okay? So to fight for the empire and potentially to die for the empire was not a precondition for home rule. That was home rule. Okay? Gandhi was in effect asserting an identity between home rule and the willingness to die for the empire. The vexations and implications of this audacious claim, which understandably irritated nationalists, lay in part in the etymological elaboration and dispute. The term home rule was a translation of the Sanskrit and Hindi term Swaraj, which Gandhi himself always preferred, which is a conjunction of the two words Swar and Raj, the former meaning self, the latter rule. For Gandhi, the term Swaraj had an essential resonance with the conditions under which the individual self rules him or herself. The idea of ruling oneself for Gandhi itself involved scrupulously abiding by normative injunctions which the individual gave to him or herself. In his autobiography, while recalling his reasons for advocating that Indians volunteer for the battlefront in Europe during the First World War, Gandhi remained insistent on what he had previously argued. He said, and now I quote from the autobiography, if I desired to retain my connection with the empire and live under its banner, one of three courses was open to me. I could declare open resistance to war and, in accordance with the law of satyagraha, boycott the empire until it changed its military policy. Or I could seek imprisonment by civil disobedience of such laws as were fit to be disobeyed. Or I could participate in the war on the side of the empire and thereby acquire the capacity and the fitness for resisting the violence of war. I lacked this capacity and fitness, and so I thought there was nothing for me to do but to serve in the war. End of quote. The passage is especially interesting because it makes clear that for Gandhi, the decision to serve in the war and fight on behalf of the empire trumped all the other options of which he was fully aware, namely of resisting the military policy of the British and or courting imprisonment by offering civil disobedience against selected laws. Despite these options, both of which were had a more proximate relationship with non-violence, Gandhi endorsed the more absolute option of supporting the war and going to battle. The reasons he gave for this were themselves striking. They were first that he lived under the protective banner of the empire and wished to retain a connection to it. On this reckoning, he had a sort of Socratic obligation to the empire, which was not absolved by his criticism of it. But in addition, and this was the primary reason, on Gandhi's view, Indians lacked the appropriate capacity to resist the violence of war, and that is, to be truly non-violent. Such a capacity or fitness for non-violence could only be secured through the experience of war itself and the risking of life that it entailed. Non-violence could not be ratified by a mere abstract appeal to principles. Here, as elsewhere, Gandhi expresses a paradoxical conception of choice. It was only by placing oneself in a situation where choice itself was denied, as he says, there was nothing for me to do but serve, and that choosing appropriately connected the self with its own actions. It was this connection that ultimately mattered most to Gandhi, and he saw it, despite his advocacy of volunteering for war, as being the crucial ethical ground for vindicating non-violence and self-rule. I should just say, to the best of my knowledge, the only job Gandhi ever asked for in his life was the job he sought in the spring of 1918 when he asked the Viceroy to appoint him as recruiter general in charge of recruiting men to fight in the war in Europe. He spent the spring of 1980 going from village to village in Gujarat, raising volunteers who were then sent to Europe. And again, in the letter that he writes to the Viceroy saying, please appoint me as a recruiter general, he lists with distinct pride all the wars that he has participated in, from the Zulu campaign, Spienkov, to the First World War. And he says, look, there's nobody more qualified for raising an army to fight than I am. So he's very, very proud of his credentials as somebody who has actively participated in battle. There was yet another reason for Gandhi's advocating that the Indians fight in support of the empire. Gandhi was fully aware that the stakes in the First World War were the very survival of the British itself. In refusing to fight, the Indians would in effect be giving at least tacit approval to a force that threatened to destroy the British. Faced with what for Gandhi was the cowardly choice of sitting on the sidelines and wishing for some other force to do away with the British or appearing that way, he was insistent on the courageous option. It was one which viewed the British, notwithstanding Gandhi's critical view of the sort of civilization they represented, as something other than enemies, because it was essential for him that they be thought of ethically rather than politically. Fighting for the British was thus doubly motivated, first as the means to acquire the fitness that was required to secure the grounds for one's own self-rule, and second in the fact that it helped secure the identity of one's opponent as an ethical subject, and hence one's opposition to him as itself an ethical opposition. So what was the deeper purpose that undergirded such tenacity, raising all these men to go and fight, for a cause that was distant, and for an interest that was obscure, and for values that appeared starkly at odds with the behavior that he was insisting on. After all, he was insisting on nonviolence, and the behavior he was advocating was go to war. In a letter to Esther Faring in June 1918, just around the same time, Gandhi wrote, "I felt at once that I was playing with the greatest problem of life in not tackling the question of joining the army seriously. Either one must renounce the benefits of the state or help to the best of our ability to prosecute the war. We are not ready to renounce. Indians have a double duty to perform. If we are to preach the mission of peace, we must first prove our ability in war. This is a terrible discovery, but it is true. A nation that is unfit to fight cannot from experience prove the virtue of not fighting. I do not infer from this that India must fight, but I say that India must know how to fight. Ahimsa is the eradication of the desire to injure or kill." End of quote. The terrible discovery was that real nonviolence could not just be an abstract value. It had to stem from a profound type of choice in which violence and nonviolence were both tactile realities, and in which there was a preparedness for both. One could only exercise the choice in favor of nonviolence through the intimate immediacy of the ability to be violent and even to kill. The experience of battle was therefore crucial. It represented the conditions under which choice itself became fully self-conscious, or to put it in terms that Gandhi might have used, the choice stemmed from the resoluteness of the soul. Gandhi was not just concerned with behavior, understood as an externally manifest act, but rather from the internal comportment that backed the behavior. Gandhi went to the absurd extent of claiming that he was absolutely right, that's a quote, in calling upon and I'm quoting now, in calling upon every Indian to join the army, always telling him at the same time that he was doing so not for the lust of blood, but for the sake of learning not to fear death. End of quote. Gandhi's language is carefully crafted. It balances on the razor edge that marks out the distinction between being prepared and willing to fight and yet not wanting to kill, and learning not to fear death in the context of battle, and yet not lusting for blood or being motivated by the image of the enemy. These distinctions may be perilously thin in some practical sense or on the battlefield, but in terms of the conception of the self and the vision of life that they refer to, they are sharply contrasting and belong to different universes of meaning. The project of life from which Gandhi's conception of self-sacrifice and suffering emerges, and by reference to which it must be made sense of, should not be confused with a starkly different project with which, in a practical sense, it shares a common space and even a common mode of behavior. Indeed, the fact that an ethic of non-violence is pried from such close proximity to the site of utter violence is not merely an example of opposites meeting, but for Gandhi is evidence of a broader ontological and cosmological conviction in which non-violence names a particular transcendent response to a world which, despite that response, remains unsparingly violent. One might say that for Gandhi, moral action did not change the world. At any rate, that was not its primary motive. Change, if it occurred, happened through a secondary implication, one which in any case was more important to Gandhi, by changing one's relationship to the world. This is the same thing, the way Gandhi interprets Krishna's injunction to Arjun in the Gita, where what Gandhi emphasizes is Krishna telling Arjun, look, whether you fight or you don't fight, violence will continue. The point of non-violence is not to lower violence. Violence is just written into the structure of the world. Okay? So non-violence is not there to, as it were, decrease the quantity of violence. Violence is a kind of ontological fact for Gandhi. Okay? Learning not to fear death, that's his remark. The remark bears repeating because it is at the core of what I have called Gandhi's most radical intervention into Indian modernity by signaling an account of which resisted its incorporation into familiar European and nationalist patterns. After all, it was precisely the fearing of death, in part because on his view it did not need to be learnt, that served as the keystone of the account of modern politics that Thomas Hobbes had offered at the dawn of European modernity. That account, by emphasizing fear of death and the corresponding importance of security as fundamental and natural human attributes, served many purposes. The decisive feature of the natural condition in Hobbes was not natural death, along with the anxiety that it might engender, but rather death that was violent and painful, which was the product of fierce competition, scarcity, and distorted passions, and thus wholly tied to a materialist and non-metaphysical or transcendent context. The subjective analogue of the prospect of such a death was a condition of universal and acute fear. One of Hobbes's many achievements was to normalize the expectation of such a death in an unregulated condition, and correspondingly to have normalized the fear that was a permanent accompaniment to it. Death, one might say, in Hobbes ceased to be natural. Instead, like its political redress, it became something artificial. For Hobbes, writing in the shadow of the English Civil Wars and the century of sectarian conflict that had preceded it, the concern with security served as a way of muffling the language of religion by showing that there had to be a prior concern with corporeal life itself before religion could minister to anyone's soul. Hobbes's great success lay in decisively recasting the meaning of the Roman and Christian formula salus populi suprema lex esto, where salus now no longer referred to salvation, but rather to the safety of individuals, and more importantly, to the security of political society as a whole. But in emphasizing the fear of death as natural and hence ineradicable, Hobbes also laid out the grounds for the permanent importance of the state as the best and only means for assuaging that fear, by offering some, however qualified, prospect of security, which, according to Hobbes, was totally absent in the unregulated state of nature. The fear of death and the concern with corporeal life was thus the enduring underlying basis of modern politics, at least in that tradition. Correspondingly, fear and the search for security acquire their salience as markers of the political only in the modern era. It is around these concepts that European modernity has articulated its own self-understanding as producing a political culture which, by containing but never eradicating the fear of death, was able to create the conditions for peace and hence the conditions for the exercise of freedom along with other lauded values. This was the narrative that nationalists typically accepted or borrowed, adding the caveat that freedom and security of the nation had to be vouched for by the people who belonged to it and to whom it belonged. Whatever the particular form that the nation assumed, whether republican, despotic, or anchored in shared allegiances to a common faith, or built around the traditional authority of ruling families or clans, they all projected themselves and sought legitimacy for the power that they had, by emphasizing the primacy of the security that they allegedly offered. They have in effect claimed to be able to keep the problem of death for the individual citizen at bay, or rather to keep him or her in that penumbral space where the citizen is safe and simultaneously available for political sacrifice. But that sacrifice is always for the sake of the community, and thus primarily in the service of plumbing, and thus never primarily in the service of plumbing the depths of the human. European modernity has also been articulated around another category, different from those, different though closely related to the political, namely the social. There is a family of familiar accounts, often linked with the magisterial work of Norbert Elias on the civilizing process, in which civility referred to the slow accretion of new domestic and public practices which produced what came to be known as a civilized society. The broad impetus for this was the intermingling of new groups of people who had to accommodate to each other's differences. Over time, this process produced a society that displaced the older language of etiquette and manners, along with feudal and aristocratic norms, and thus paved the way for an ascending liberal and commercial world. In Keith Baker's work, with its focus on French history, the idea and the fact of society was a response to the epistemological, moral, religious, and political challenges that marked the 17th century crisis of values. Society, Keith Baker wrote, was the invention of a middle ground between certainty and doubt, religion and relativism, grace and despair, absolute power and anarchy. End of quote. Moreover, it had within it all the resources that would give society, especially to the middle classes, the energy and the sense of purpose to gradually displace displace violence with legality, extend the ambit of trust beyond the family, and widen the scope of empathy and reciprocity, while also securing the basis to exploit and govern the working classes, control subaltern groups, and in its liberal imperial guise represent itself as a progressive force for much of the world. Gandhi abstained from every aspect of these broad narratives of society and social development. He was indifferent to the historicism that is essential to these narratives, because nothing of any importance in Gandhi, in my view, turns on the logic of history or historical development. He viewed such a satyagraha as something which escaped the political and social processes with which history was typically concerned. Quote, satyagraha being natural is not rooted in history. This did not mean that he thought of human beings as living in some timeless zone of immobility, only that he did not accept the typical social and political narratives which history offered up as the basis of individual and collective self-understanding. He did not, for example, think that Indian civilization had to or should conceive of itself as bound to a teleology whose inevitable outcome was the nation state or a condition of economic modernity. Correspondingly, he abstained from endorsing the driving frictions that are internal to these grand historical narratives, accounts such as class struggle, the increase of the productive forces, the logic of capitalist development or imperialist expansion, or the impulse to enlarge the domain of social and political freedom through constitutional commitments. Such abstentions did not make him indifferent to social and economic woes such as deprivation, gross inequality, exploitation, or the abuse and abridgment of rights. It was just that his view on these matters did not share the causal logic that typically organizes such narratives. He abstained from these accounts for a very simple reason, in my view. Society, as a project of whole-scale refashioning, was simply not a problem in Gandhi's view. His thought is not spurred by the Manichaean contrast that underlies and guides the vision of so much of modern political thought, where the only alternative to political order is the asocial and and diabolical ravages of anarchy. It is not that Gandhi accepts or commends every aspect of society. He clearly did not, as is obvious from his work on the problem of untouchability in the Hindu caste framework or many other social woes. But even on these matters, his emphasis is not on social development or on producing a new kind of society marked by a radical rearrangement of social relations or ruptures in existing patterns of life. Gandhi was never drawn to the dream of a new kind of society or of a new kind of man. His vision comes from a palette that draws from the materials of ordinary life. He could and did imagine a society with very different hues and shapes, without nevertheless replacing the palette itself. The rigors of civility were meant as a way to alter the relationship of the self to itself and to the world beyond, for this ordinary life, and from the midst of the ordinary or from the midst of the existing configuration of society. Gandhi's thought, as anyone familiar with his letters and their obsessive attention to meals, ablutions, medicines, schedules, and even to things knows, is never free from a focus on the precise conditions of life, even when he is urging fearlessness and a willingness to die. There is a social focus here, but nothing like a social agenda. The challenge of civility arose from within the midst of the actuality of society. It did not require conceiving of society itself as a problem. By way of contrast, it is hard to imagine Gandhi ever writing the following sentences, which come from Nehru's discovery of India and which capture the broader thrust of Nehru's view of Indian society. And now I quote from Discovery. Indian life became a sluggish stream, living in the past, moving slowly through the accumulation of dead centuries. The heavy burden of the past crushes it, and a kind of coma seizes it. It is not surprising that in this condition of mental stupor and physical weariness, India should have deteriorated and remained rigid and immobile, while other parts of the world marched on ahead. End of quote. These thoughts anticipate what would become the Nehruvian emphasis on the state as the medium for reforming a recalcitrant society, equipped with the expertise of modern science and knowledge, spurred by an ideology of progress and social justice, prepared when the need arose to deploy the blunt power of the police, and always reliant on an elite cadre of leaders. Here, indeed, was an appropriately abstract social and political vision, fully divested of any transcendent purposes, offered in supportive response to a familiar reading of European and colonial history. Despite Nehru's unremitting weariness and images of mournful death and lassitude, there is an unmistakable optimism in this project. Rabindranath Tagore often objected to Gandhi's call for satyagraha on the grounds that the demand of self-sacrifice was only appropriate for heroes and not for the common man or woman. I'm nearly done. There was a democratic sensibility in Tagore's objection because it vouched for the mundane fears of the common man and woman. George Orwell, in his famous review of Gandhi's autobiography, had made much the same point. Gandhi rejected the suggestion, but it gave him pause. He recognized in Tagore's thought a rationalist anxiety similar to that around which Hobbes had outlined the entire architecture of modern political thought. But Gandhi's emphasis on courage and fearlessness also had a democratic sensibility informing it. It was different but nevertheless democratic in its psychological insight and moral hopes and expectations. Gandhi once wrote to Charlie Andrews that non-violence could only be taught by a Kshatriya to another Kshatriya, that is, from a warrior to another warrior, and that untouchables and Kshatriyas as a caste celebrated the same common human capacity, namely courage and the possibility of overcoming fear. Gandhi recognized that actualizing this capacity requires an extremism of the self through practices of celibacy, fasting, courting death, other forms of what might be called self-vigilance and mortification. These qualities had none of the balance and ordered unity that Tagore identified with art, religion, and creativity more generally, and which he so admired, especially in the cosmological poems of Blake and, of course, in musical meter. Balance is not a term one should associate with Gandhi. For Gandhi, it was the unbounded qualities of love, truth, faith that were the ground of a deeply spiritual life. But each of these for him was only enabled by another unbounded quality, namely individual courage. That courage was also the ground of a democratic vision which, notwithstanding its demanding severity and peculiar excesses, was in principle common to all. Judith Shklar, the famous Harvard political theorist, in her famous essay, The Liberalism of Fear, emphasized that notions such as self-sacrifice were, quote, acts of supererogation that fall outside the realm of politics, end of quote. For her, all forms of political spirituality stemmed from a contempt for physical experience, and thus typically served as excuses of what she called orgies of destruction. Gandhi would have agreed that self-sacrifice was not a political duty. In this sense, he shared Shklar's view that politics must be chastened and limited, and that its task is not to offer the prospect of human perfection. But the idea and the vision associated with civility, which for Gandhi rested on courage and self-sacrifice, referred to a juncture where the imperatives of politics and ethics meet or are conditioned by each other. Implicit in that juncture was an exacting vision that pointed to something that exceeded politics. Gandhi's passions found their clearest focus in the myriad, often trivial details that constitute the texture of everyday life. He wanted to infuse that life with the spirit of civility as he understood it. The courage of being willing to die was the essential question of the human, which for Gandhi was always conditioned by the transcendent and the utterly mundane. This was a rare sensibility that understood that spirit exists in the actuality of the many trivial things that make up life as it is lived. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. We're lucky to have a healthy amount of time for questions, and Shankar Ramaswamy has chosen to exercise his capacity as discussant by starting off with a few, I think, but the idea is to open it up to the whole group. Shankar, you wanted to start with a few questions, is that right?
Yes, I guess I will. Professor Mehta, A Different Vision, Gandhi's Critique of Political Rationality. That's the new working title, right?
Yeah.
Okay, greatly looking forward to this book on Gandhi. As usual, I mean, it's a wonderful paper. As usual, you're always giving us fresh perspectives on major thinkers. And I hope this book will be widely read. So I will always feel part of the privileged few who did, in fact, read Anxiety of Freedom. So it should be at least 5. Now, a question I have, though, Professor Mehta, is can this vision that you are trying to write about and understand, can Gandhi's ideas and visions, I won't say political, because I know you like to call them anti-political. Can these ideas and visions be properly understood and recovered if we do not also delve into Gandhi's theological ideas and vision? So my comment has to do with the potential relationship of ethics, politics, and theology. So when you talk about this group of qualities, courage, fearlessness, the willingness to die, the overcoming of the fear of death, learning not to fear death, from where is all of this to arise? That is to say, from what self-understandings and cosmological visions? I ask this because it seems to me that when in answering this question, we must deviate or go beyond the respectable boundaries of political philosophy and move into other areas which you've also touched upon in this essay. So, for example, right. So Gandhi says that bravery is not a quality of the body, it is the soul. Mm-hmm. He also says that, that all fears revolve around the body at the center and disappear as soon as one got rid of the attachment for the body. We thus find that all fear is the baseless fabric of our own vision. Fear has no place in our hearts when we have shaken off the attachment for wealth, for family, and for the body. And then this leads into a discussion of how all these things actually belong to God. Mm-hmm. So fearlessness seems, another thing about fearlessness, it seems to arise, so it has something to do with, sometimes he talks about it as rising in the heart, sometimes the soul, but it seems to also arise from a very important fear, which it seems to me Gandhi wants to retain, which is the fear of God. So as he says, let us fear God and we shall cease to fear man. This is another interesting passage that where he distinguishes the nonviolence and violence when he says, the votary of ahimsa has only one fear, that is of God. He who seeks refuge in God ought to have a glimpse of the Atman, the soul, the self, that transcends the body. And the moment one has a glimpse of the imperishable Atman, one sheds the love of the perishable body. Training in nonviolence is thus diametrically opposed to training in violence. Violence is needed for the protection of things external. Nonviolence is needed for the protection of the Atman, for the protection of one's honor. So this is very interesting to me, and it seems to me that, well, do we not need to understand this vision of body, soul, God, and also in your talk is an idea of temporality, of time, in order to understand these otherwise seemingly secular terms like courage, which are crucial in your critique of political rationality. I think that it works, and a second question is, I think it works the other way too, which is that when Gandhi says, reflecting on 30 years of his life, that the goal of my life, entire life, has been to see God face to face, to attain moksha, liberation. Mm-hmm. Now, I'd like to read that as being not only his aspiration, but that he would like to see such liberation for all. And that is, in a sense, what I would like to see as driving his quote-unquote politics, that it is not the kind of social engineering that you are talking about in political theory or in ideas of development, but autonomous social transformations which can make this possible. So these are not, it seems to me, separate activities.
So just say the last part ago. What's the separate thing?
The politics and the theology.
Yeah.
The idea of wanting to,
wanting
your whole life as being directed to the darshan of God, which is, to me, intimately linked to the idea of Swaraj and all of the minute details of how everyday life can be transformed and reimagined so as to perhaps make this liberation possible in various, of course, religious traditions. So I guess that I will, Professor Mehta, in the paper itself, you touch on these things, resoluteness of the soul, cosmological vision. And in one part of the, I think, larger paper, you have a quote by Gandhi who says that our weapon is our faith in God. Now, how do you actually see these terms then functioning in the vision you are trying to outline and the purposes to which it is put?
Luckily, I know Shankar for a long, long time, so I'm not at all surprised by these kind of really difficult and provoking questions and thought-provoking questions. I've thought a little bit about this, and it seems to me there are occasions when Gandhi is thinking of his own life, and he thinks of his own life very much in terms of Hindu categories. Rebirth, darshan, seeing his creator. And so he says very explicitly, that's the purpose of my life, is to get another vision of the creator. It's also, as you know, the case that when he identifies the sources, the principal sources of his vision, of his broader conception, he speaks in terms of the New Testament, especially Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount. He speaks in terms of Ruskin's Unto That Last. He speaks in terms of Tolstoy. These are all religious. These are all religious works, or works with a religious inspiration. Okay? So it's tempting to think that, look, you know, instead of saying civility refers to that conjunction of the political and the ethical that points to the absolute, I should say civility is that conjunction of the ethical and the political that points to the religious, the transcendent. I fudge it by saying the absolute. Okay? And I fudge it intentionally, I think, because there are also many moments, it seems to me, I can think of in Gandhi where he does not link notions such as courage and nonviolence. It does not link them firmly to a theological or a religious concept. So he allows them, as it were, to have a secular meaning. But they always seem to me to refer to something that exceeds a kind of instrumental rationality. Okay. So that's why I think you're right. When he's thinking of himself, he's almost always thinking in terms of categories such as moksha, seeing his creator, etc. But I think just as often, and for instance, in the episode that I have looked at in some detail, this 1918 episode regarding the war, he doesn't actually invoke religious notions that much. So that's
I think we're off to a very good start. So.
For the sake of the recording, can we pass the mic around?
Sure. Okay. I'll ask them. So it seems as though in response to Shankar, in response to Shankar, you're suggesting that there's a certain kind of factoring is possible. So when Gandhi is talking about himself, he's willing to link certain kinds of concepts, ideas, whatever. They're embedded in a theological picture.
Yeah.
And yet when he's referring to people other than himself, the same terms and concepts are not linked. And so it seems though you think it's possible to factor out the theological. And I guess I have a question about whether that's right. It seems to me that by theological, in the way Shankar phrased it, and the way you responded, theological is taken quite literally to mean God.
Yeah.
Instead of theological being linked more closely with cosmological,
Yeah.
which would be more consistent with Gandhi's deployment of Hindu categories in a particular way. So if we substitute cosmological for theological, let's then bring that over to where we factored out God.
Right.
Then we have to ask whether Gandhi's use and understanding of words like civil, civility, courage, and fear cannot be linked to the cosmological understanding that he has. And it seems to me that's a tougher proposition. And so I guess my question is two things. Is it fair to call something theological when we mean cosmological?
Yeah.
Maybe. And then if so, is it so easy to factor in this way?
The honest answer is I need to think more about this. I haven't thought enough about this. So I'm just going to try and think on my feet here. My sense is that what Gandhi is wedded to is some conception of the self which is not exhausted by its own materiality. So what he's wedded to is the idea that any description of the self, a la Hobbes, that is purely materialistic and which therefore takes the avoidance of death as being central, such a description of life is inaccurate. So the next question is, all right, if you don't have that description, if you say, yes, such a description is inaccurate or inadequate or incomplete, where do you go next? So one might say, well, you could go cosmological, or you could go within certain specific theological traditions, certain specific religious tradition. Okay? And my answer to Shankar was that it seems to me he does both. And so, just to give you an example, there is a time in the 20s when the Anglican Charlie Andrews is having real doubts about his faith. And he shares these doubts with Gandhi. What's striking to me is what Gandhi insists on to Charlie Andrews is you have to resolve these doubts within Anglican terms. So he doesn't, he's opposed to the orientation which is what Charlie Andrews to a certain extent is thinking, should I be thinking of myself in secular terms? Charlie Andrews doesn't put it so crudely, but it's a much more sophisticated. And Gandhi's insistence is, look, I understand your doubts, but these doubts must in some sense be resolved within the terms of Anglican theology. Now, I don't know if that helps us. What I do think, and this is all that I'm just repeating my own kind of lack of thought on this. I think for him, what's most important is that in notions such as overcoming one's fear of death, notions of self-sacrifice, he sees these notions as connecting us to that fuller description of the self, which he thinks is essential, important, and which crucially he thinks has to be considered from within the midst of everyday life. There's no going off to the Himalayas and doing this, okay? You do it in the midst of the civil satyagraha struggle. And that's what I think is fascinating, that, you know, it's 10 days after Jallianwala Bagh massacre that he says, we've got to think about self-sacrifice and all of these notions. So that's what I find unusual, that he's thinking of this notion of civility, which is this notion that takes you outside, but from the very midst of things. That's what I guess for me is interesting. But I know I haven't answered your question.
We'll have a chance later. I see, sorry, maybe hand back there and then come to Madhav since the mic is closer. Is that okay?
Thanks for that wonderful talk.
Madhav, you're next.
I was wondering whether what you just said about Charlie Andrews might be applied to Gandhi himself. That is, I'm wondering whether Gandhi was working from within his own tradition, and if so, what was the counterpoint within his own tradition that he was working against? Was he going against the orthodoxy or not? If he was not going against the orthodoxy, then would you say that Gandhi was misunderstood within his own tradition? One evidence for which was that he was assassinated by Godse. And so somebody from within his own tradition, as it were. So I'm just trying to figure out whether Gandhi was actually trying to work his problems out within his own tradition, or was he in some important measure abjuring it?
I mean, I certainly think that he has to be seen as working within his own tradition also, because, I mean, he is more condemnatory of fellow religious Hindus than of anyone else. Okay. So, for instance, in these passages where he's talking about losing the fear of dying, he says things like, he says, these Hindus, they claim to, he's talking about Hindus and Jains. So he says, these Hindus and Jains, they claim not to want to kill animals or kill anybody. And that's why they wear that muffler, you know. They don't even want to kill insects, etc. He says, this is absolute rubbish. These guys, they're just cowards. They have not overcome their fear of death. So this claim that Hinduism is non-violent, he writes to Charlie Andrews and says, what preposterousness. This is not Hinduism. Most Hindus are cowards. Most Jains are cowards. So there's a very clear sense, similarly in his interpretation of the Gita, you know, he's taking issue with a whole bunch of alternative interpretations of the Gita from within the Hindu tradition. And I honestly am not enough of a kind of Hindu scholar or a scholar of that stuff to be able to tell you, what are the relevant distinctions here. That I don't know. But I also think he's also always doing more than that. I think he's also, in some sense, engaging with other traditions. And that's part of, I think, what makes him intellectually so exciting. I mean, so interesting. So, for instance, he's very, he's very aware of how what he is saying comes very close to a line of thinking that we associate with Kant and Kant's notion of autonomy.
And public reason.
And public reason for sure, yeah. But where but he has this interesting disagreement with Kant. Okay? And this is just, I throw this out more. It's a kind of laugh. It's a joke. It's a line that'll get a laugh out of everyone. Which is he writes to a young correspondent. He says, this guy Kant. He's a really smart guy. He's really onto something in his notion of the categorical imperative, etc. He's a really smart guy. The problem with Kant, Gandhi says, is he doesn't realize to abide by the categorical imperative, you have to be a vegetarian. It gets a laugh out of people. And Gandhi's thinking is the following. He says, look, you can't actually abide by the categorical imperative unless you have control over yourself. But to have control over yourself, you can't be eating foods that excite you. So you can't be having, big hunks of red meat and think you can abide by the categorical imperative. So he is, I think, thinking in many traditions. I mean, at least that's what I find intellectually very satisfying. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
Madhav?
So this is just sort of links more broadly with the anti-political story. So part of the anti-political story is that Gandhi conceptualized a different domain in which transformation should take place, right? And let's just call it the social. And so that's one, and so it's not through the state, and so there's another alternate imagination. I was just wondering, part of the anti-political story can also be, and it's not logically at odds at least, is that if we conceive of the political story historically, right, at least in Western political thought, its great capacity has been to transform certain kinds of passions, right? And Hobbes is, of course, the exemplar here. And part of the anti-political story has been that there are actually certain passions that are good, and we don't want them purged, right? And so let's take Emile, right? So Rousseau thinks that it's a good thing that Emile has pride, because as a consequence, Emile can exercise moral judgments, right? Or take sort of Smith in TMS, right? So that's the great, it's almost like a line-by-line repudiation, right? Because at every moment it makes a certain capacity. I was wondering if you're sort of just to view your sort of anti-political theory through that lens, do you find within Gandhi fears about certain things that the space of politics might purge, and that in any way to have to be salient, right? And in a sense that's independent from what the social can actually do and the social's greater capacity for anything. So not so much as to what will be gained by the social, but what will be lost by the political, right? And I don't mean sort of some things we know, right? So the political space will necessarily be more violent. It will necessarily result in a domain where you lose control of yourself and all those kinds of things. And we see sort of people who've imbibed some of that Gandhian stuff like Nehru, right? Like struggling with those issues, particularly when he talks about non-alignment and all of that. But I was wondering whether you could find fears of that kind at all.
Somewhere I've lost the kind of nub of your question, so I might have to ask you to repeat it. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is, I mean, this part of the question I think I understood. That it's clearly the case that a very important part of modern and even ancient political philosophy is concerned with the question of silencing certain passions, pitting certain passions against other passions, you know. So in the case of, you know, Hobbes pitting fear against pride. So in that sense, political philosophy has a very complex and deep psychological understanding of human behavior. My point is slightly different. My point is saying that even in that complex understanding of human behavior, what it's wedded to is a materialist conception of the body. So, you know, it's wedded to, I mean, take Judith Shklar's famous article on the liberalism of fear. So, what she's saying is, look, politics must start and end with placing a high value on physical experience of the body. That's physical experience of the body. That's a quote. And she says, even though the reason why we are so indebted to Hobbes is because he's the one who, in a kind of Christelic form, tells us the stakes. So even though he's not a liberal, the thing Shklar likes, the debt to Hobbes is that, you know, he gives us, he sharply delineates the stakes of the physical experience, and hence of things like cruelty, torture, etc. So I'm saying what Gandhi is concerned with, in some sense, is showing the narrowness of that perspective. The narrowness of a perspective that stems from this salience of the physical experience. Now, I didn't mean to say, I hope you didn't understand me to be saying that what Gandhi is all about is social change. No, he's not society either. In fact, I don't think he's really concerned with social change at all. You know? I mean, he's concerned with some things like untouchability, but I don't think for the most part he is concerned with social change. I don't. He's concerned with something else, and I think that something else is what, for lack of a better term, I call a kind of altered relationship of the self to itself and to the world. You know? And that altered relationship cannot be spoken of in terms of categories such as equality or freedom. It's not indifferent to those things, but I don't think it can be spoken of in those terms.
We had one question over here. Yes.
Thank you very, very much for your excellent lecture. I have been trying very hard to understand Gandhi, and every time I believe that he's more and more and more complicated. Yeah. First of all,
welcome to the group.
For example, even the Indians, I'm not sure if they really understand him, because let alone the Westerners, we have a different kind of frame of reference to analyze, to interpret, to give meaning to the world. I think we have different kind of worldviews. So, but on your presentation, I'm absolutely astounding about the complexities and the complication of Gandhi. But because it seems to me, well, first of all, his frame of reference, to say, just to use a term that we use very often, is embedded in the notion of totality, which is completely alien to Westerners, I believe. We try to compartmentalize, to classify, to make taxonomies, to define absolutes. And it seems to me that it's just the opposite. In terms of change, you say change. Change needs to be historical. The notion of history, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is absent in the Indian philosophy, in the Indian tradition, in the Indian,
Yeah, I'm sure Parimal knows much more about this than I do. But yeah,
It's all yours.
yeah, no,
So-
but I think it's certainly absent in somebody like Gandhi.
But is it true that Gandhi, when he talks, he's talking at different levels of analysis?
Yeah.
And the difficulty for the person who listens to him is to
Yeah.
pick up the level of analysis that he's talking
Yeah,
about.
absolutely. You're absolutely right, I think. You're right. He is, I think, talking. And I mean, this is part of the charm, the deceptive charm of his simplicity. That, you know, it seems so, I mean, there couldn't be a work simpler than Hind Swaraj, and yet I think in some sense it is, that simplicity is so deceptive. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe two more questions. So we have one hand here and I think one hand.
This will probably be a more mundane one than the ones that followed. So going back to this idea about being willing to fight, being willing to participate in war, to then be able to undertake satyagraha. This leads to the question, what are the criteria Gandhi is using to decide which is a good war to practice your sort of fearlessness of death in, or which violent episodes are good and which are bad. Because there's many instances, many condemnations, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't run around and kill people on the street and all these episodes that happen. So what is he doing? And how is he getting himself out of this sort of hole once you've allowed for participation in a conflict?
Yeah, I think there isn't a general criteria or an abstract criteria in Gandhi for making that determination. And let me try and explain why I don't think there is a kind of abstract criteria. So if you look at a passage that I read from the autobiography, where he's justifying his call for Indians to go and fight in the First World War. The justification there turns on not the sort of criteria that just war theorists invoke. There's no just war theory criteria here. Instead, he's saying things like, look, we are dependent on the British, we seek their protection, therefore we must protect them. Completely circumstantial reason. We are as yet not fit for Swaraj. We need to make ourselves fit for Swaraj. Again, a very kind of a a criteria with a low level of abstraction. My point is, similarly, why should Arjun fight in the Mahabharata? Virtually no abstract reason is given. He says, or what Gandhi is impressed by is Krishna saying to Arjun, look, if you don't fight, these people's wives and kids will be killed. Aren't you concerned about that? So now he's invoking this kind of familial category. My point is that I don't think Gandhi has an abstract theory of what should be fought in and which should not. Okay? And that for me is telling, because I don't think that's the level at which Gandhi is thinking. He's not thinking like an Augustine. He's not, that is to say, a just war theorist. He's not asking, he's asking a question at a much lower level of abstraction. Similarly, when in 1938 he writes these famous two articles in his journal Harijan, where he's offering guidance to the Jews of Germany. What should they do? And he says, if I were you, if I were a German Jew born and bred in Germany, then I would, instead of abiding by these discriminatory laws that the Nazis have just issued, then I would say to the Nazis, I defy your laws even if you come and kill me. And that's what Martin Buber and others, of course, interpreted as Gandhi's call for German Jews to commit collective suicide. It wasn't a call for collective suicide. Suicide is something Gandhi truly despised. What he was saying was, if I were a Jew, in the most mundane sense of the word, in the most socially mundane sense of the word, if I was born here, if I earned my livelihood here, if I worked here, then I would say to the Nazis, I defy your discriminatory laws, even at the expense of my life. Because, as Gandhi says in that famous passage, because that's the only way through which I can preserve my self-respect. Only way I can preserve my self-respect is by being prepared to lose my life. So notice here, the way the justification works is very similar to the way the justification works in the First World War example, as recalled in the autobiography, where he's giving a bunch of very mundane facts, we need the protection of the British, etc., etc., etc. Nothing abstract. So, in some sense, I think what's interesting to me about Gandhi is he refuses to answer your question at a level of abstraction.
We have time for one just last efficient question.
Yeah, well, sticking with that last answer, I think I'll change my question as a matter of fact. Gandhi, in that vein, also said that the Jews had erred grievously in attempting to impose themselves forcefully on Palestine, and he also said that it was a double mistake in using the aid of the British and the Americans economically and with arms, and then by resorting to naked terror. So at times he does seem very prescient, but
it's in the same article that he
right,
says.
exactly.
In the same.
But before and after the war, he was very concerned about this, but he didn't follow through and elaborate it. So I'm wondering, in a more mundane sense, where this new relation to the self, even though you see some seminal ideas approaching practical political decision-making, would have led him into a kind of labyrinth as the 20th century and the nuclear age and the modern state system came into existence, or whether it was tied more historically than he was willing to admit to his own circumstances in his colonial era. You can answer that in several volumes.
An efficient question that may not have an efficient answer.
I don't have an efficient answer.
Why don't we leave Professor Mehta to think about that? But first, join me in thanking him for a really remarkable talk. Thank you very much.